They said the Duke of Ashvale married her out of obligation and forgot her name by morning. They were almost right. On the evening of the 14th of October, in the year 1814, Miss Eleanor Voss became a duchess in a ceremony so brief and so devoid of warmth that the candles in the chapel had not yet burned a quarter of their length by the time the rector closed his book. There were no guests who had come for her. No flowers chosen to suit her taste. The groom did not look at her face once during the vows, and when the register was signed, he handed her his name the way a man hands a coat to a footman, without thought, without ceremony. Without any acknowledgement that she was a living creature standing before him. What no one in that cold chapel understood, least of all the Duke himself, was that Eleanor Voss had already decided something in the silence of that first night, something quiet and resolute and impossibly brave. She had decided that she would not be erased. Not by his indifference. Not by his absence. Not by the crumbling northern estate to which he would send her and never visit. Not by the staff who watched her arrive with pity in their eyes and doubt in the set of their mouths. She would not be erased. And the Duke of Ashvale, when he finally returned to Ashvale Hall 14 months later, would find that the woman he had dismissed without a second glance had built something remarkable in the ruin he had given her. He would find that he was the stranger. And she was the home. The arrangement had been her father's idea, though calling it an idea was generous. It had been a transaction, plain and desperate, born in the back room of a solicitor's office in London on a Tuesday in August. Eleanor's father, Sir Edmund Voss, was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one, which in many ways was worse. His debts had compounded quietly for a decade, the way rot works through the beams of an old house, invisible until the floor gives way. When it finally gave way, it did so entirely. The creditors came not one at a time but in a wave, and Sir Edmund, standing in the wreckage of the fortune he had neither earned nor managed wisely, had done the only thing he could think to do. He had offered his eldest daughter. The Duke of Ashvale had not attended a single meeting regarding the arrangement. His solicitor, a dry and careful man named Mr. Petherwick, had handled the matter entirely. The Duke's terms had been relayed in a single page of correspondence, and they were not unkind so much as they were surgical. He required a wife of good family and quiet reputation. He required no scandal, no debt of her own, and no objection to residing at Ashvale Hall in the North Riding of Yorkshire while he continued his affairs in London. He would provide a generous allowance. He would expect nothing beyond the performance of the public function the title required. Eleanor had read the letter twice, sitting at the desk in her father's study, her hands quite still in her lap. She was 23 years old. She had a degree of education unusual for a woman of her station, having had access to her late uncle's library from the age of 9, and she had opinions about agriculture, household economics, and the management of tenant estates that she had never had occasion to express to anyone who might find them useful. She was not beautiful in the conventional way that drawing rooms demanded. Her face was too direct, her mouth too precise, her gray eyes too steady for the softness men preferred. But she was capable, and she knew it, and that knowledge had always been a private and sustaining thing. She folded the letter and set it aside and did not weep. The wedding day arrived the way appointments arrive, on schedule, without sentiment. The Duke of Ashvale was 31 years of age, and he was, she conceded privately as he stood at the altar, a physically remarkable man. Tall, with the broad shoulders of someone who had not spent his entire life in drawing rooms, and a face that was constructed entirely of planes and restraint, dark eyes, a strong jaw. A mouth set in the permanent careful expression of a man who had learned very young not to show what he felt. He was not unkind during the ceremony. He was simply absent, the way a person can be standing directly before you and absent nonetheless. At the wedding breakfast afterward, held in the London townhouse with 6 people present including 2 solicitors, the Duke spoke to Eleanor for the first time with any directness. He said, "I trust you understand the nature of our arrangement, Miss Voss." "Your Grace," she replied, "I believe it is Duchess Voss now." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. For perhaps 3 full seconds, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not name. Then it was gone, shuttered away behind that careful face, and he nodded once and excused himself from the table. That night, her first night as his wife, the Duke came to her room. He stood at the doorway in his dressing gown and told her, quietly and without drama, that he would not be requiring her presence in that particular way. He had no interest in producing an heir immediately, and he had no wish to make her uncomfortable. He would be departing for London in the morning. She would be traveling to Ashvale Hall in 3 days' time. The housekeeper, Mrs. Drury, would receive her. Then he paused. Something in her face, or perhaps her absolute stillness, her refusal to either crumble or protest, made him pause. "I am not a bad man," he said. It sounded, unexpectedly, like something he needed to believe rather than something he was offering her. "I have not yet decided what you are," Eleanor said. "Good night, Your Grace." He left. And she stood at the window of her bridal chamber and looked out at the dark London street below and made the quiet, iron decision that would define the next 14 months of her life. She would go north. She would go to the estate he did not care enough to visit. And she would make something of it. Not for him. For herself. Ashvale Hall appeared through the carriage window on a morning of low cloud and thin rain, and Eleanor's first thought was that someone had given up on it long before she arrived. The approach lane was deeply rutted, the drainage ditches overgrown with blackthorn. The kitchen gardens she glimpsed through the iron gate were a tangle of dead stems and collapsed canes. 2 of the upper windows on the east wing were boarded, and the stone steps to the main entrance had grown a fringe of moss along their edges that spoke of long neglect. Mrs. Drury met her at the door, a woman of perhaps 60, with a face that was not unfriendly but was deeply uncertain. As if she had been rehearsing an expression of welcome for someone she was not sure deserved it. "Your Grace," she said, with a curtsy that was correct in form if not in warmth. "Mrs. Drury," Eleanor said. "I would like a cup of tea, a tour of the household accounts, and an honest assessment of every room in this house before supper. Not all at once. But in that order." The housekeeper blinked. Eleanor stepped inside. The interior of Ashvale Hall was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season. The fires had been laid in the main receiving rooms as a matter of form, but the heat had not had time to establish itself. And the house had the particular chill of a space that had not been truly inhabited in a long time. Dust covers still draped several pieces of furniture in the drawing room. The library, when she found it, was locked, and the key was not on Mrs. Drury's ring. The staff numbered 7, reduced, she learned, from a household that had once employed 22. There was a cook, a kitchen maid, 2 housemaids, a footman, a groom, and Mrs. Drury herself. They were not idle people, but they were depleted people, the kind who have been managing scarcity for so long that they have forgotten what sufficiency felt like. The accounts, when Eleanor finally sat down with them before the fire in the small parlor that seemed least unhappy with itself, told a story she recognized immediately. Not corruption. Not theft. Simply abandonment. The estate rents had not been reviewed in 4 years. Several tenant farms were paying rates set before the war, rates that made no sense against the current cost of seed and labor. 2 farms had failed entirely and their fields had gone untenanted. A repair fund established a decade ago had never been drawn upon and was sitting untouched in a London account, earning nothing, while the East Wing crumbled in the Yorkshire rain. Eleanor closed the ledger and sat with her hands folded over it for a long moment. Then she asked Mrs. Drury to bring her pen and paper. She wrote 6 letters that evening. 1 to the Duke's London solicitor, requesting authorization to access the estate repair account. 1 to the tenant agent, requesting a meeting at his earliest convenience. 1 to the local magistrate, introducing herself. 1 to the village rector, whose name she had found in the household register. 1 to a glazier in the nearest market town, regarding the boarded windows. And 1 to her own former governess, a capable and underemployed woman named Miss Agnes Pendleton, asking if she would consider coming north to serve as a companion and assist with the household. She sealed them all and handed them to the footman for posting. Then she went to bed in the ducal bedchamber, which she had chosen not because of its grandeur but because it had the most functional fireplace, and she slept deeply, without dreams. For the first time in months. The first year at Ashvale Hall was not triumphant. It was simply work, and Eleanor understood work in a way she had never had cause to demonstrate before. She learned the names of all 7 staff within her first week, not merely their formal names but their particular histories, where they had grown up, which of them had family in the village. Which of them had been at Ashvale the longest and therefore knew its systems and its secrets best. Old Thomas, the groom, had worked the estate for 34 years and knew which fields drained properly and which became impassable in spring. Cook, whose name was Mrs. Beale, kept a kitchen garden of herbs she had planted herself along the sheltered south wall, and she knew every family in the village by their appetites at harvest time. Eleanor listened. She asked questions. She did not pretend to know things she did not know. The repair account, unlocked after 2 weeks of correspondence with the solicitor, was sufficient to address the most critical failings of the estate. Eleanor spent it carefully and deliberately: the glazier for the windows, a local mason for the crumbling stable wall, new drainage cut along the approach lane before the worst of winter set in. She did not spend a shilling on the interiors. She did not replace the dust covers in the drawing room. She was not decorating. She was preserving. Miss Agnes Pendleton arrived in November, sharp-eyed and practical and delighted to be needed, and together they turned their attention to the tenant farms. Eleanor rode out, on a steady old mare named Patience, who suited her purpose perfectly, to meet each farming family in turn. She sat in their kitchens and drank their tea and learned exactly what each farm required. She renegotiated the rents herself, working from figures she had researched carefully, bringing the rates into alignment with the realities of post-war agricultural life. 3 families wept with relief. One old farmer named Caleb Marsh held her hand for a long moment after she told him his arrears were forgiven, and said, "Your Grace, where have you been?" "I am here now," she said. Miss Pendleton also drew Eleanor's attention to 4 children living in the household of Caleb Marsh's daughter. The woman had fallen ill in the autumn, and her husband worked the fields from before dawn, and the children were going without schooling and, on some days, without adequate food. Eleanor established a small schoolroom in the unused morning room at the hall, opened it 3 mornings a week, and asked the rector's wife if she knew of any women in the village who might be willing to assist. Within a month, 11 children were coming to the hall on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings, and Mrs. Drury, who had initially regarded this development with considerable alarm, had taken to setting out bread and butter for them all in the kitchen afterward with the severity of a woman who is determined not to enjoy something and is failing entirely. The months passed. The east wing was partially reopened. The walled garden was cleared and replanted, slowly, by Eleanor's own hands on the days when the weather permitted it and her letters were written and her accounts balanced. The library was unlocked, the key found in the bottom of a storage chest in the steward's room, and Eleanor discovered within it a correspondence archive going back 40 years that told her more about the Ashvale estate and its history and its failures and its possibilities than anything the solicitor had been willing to share. She did not think about the Duke often. She thought about him in the abstract, the way one thinks about weather, not with feeling but with the practical awareness that it was a factor she would eventually have to account for. What she did not know, because no one had seen fit to tell her, was that the Duke had been in correspondence with Mr. Petherwick throughout the year, receiving quarterly reports on the estate. And that each report, describing in careful bureaucratic language the changes she was making, had left the Duke sitting at his London desk in a state of quiet, unsettling confusion. He had expected, if he had expected anything at all, that the estate would continue its slow decline and that his new wife would write him reproachful letters and require to be brought back to London to take her proper place in society. He had expected fragility. He had expected complaint. He had received neither. He came north in December of the following year, unannounced. He arrived in the early afternoon of a Thursday. And the first person he encountered was not Eleanor but a small girl of perhaps 7 years who was sitting on the stone steps of the main entrance with a book open in her lap and a piece of chalk in her hand, copying letters onto a piece of grey slate. She looked up at him without alarm and said, "Are you lost?" "I am," he said, before he could stop himself, "the Duke of Ashvale." The child considered this. "The Duchess says you might come," she said. She didn't say when. He stood in the entrance hall and looked at the hall he had last seen 3 years prior. It was the same house. It was not the same house. The floors had been cleaned to a warmth he did not remember. The smell of wood smoke and bread and something herbal, rosemary, perhaps, replaced the faint damp and disuse he had always associated with the place. A vase of late winter greenery stood on the hall table. The mirror above it had been cleaned. Through the open door to the left, he could hear the sound of children's voices and a woman speaking in a measured, instructive tone. Mrs. Drury appeared and stopped when she saw him, and for a fraction of a second, something crossed her face that was not quite welcome, something more complicated and more honest than welcome. "Your Grace," she said. "Where is the Duchess?" "In the walled garden, Your Grace. She goes in the afternoons when the light holds." He found her there, in the garden that had been a ruin when he last saw it. She was on her knees in the winter earth, her gloves dark with soil, examining something at the base of a dormant rose cane. She was wearing a plain gray wool dress and a heavy coat that was too large for her, probably taken from the household stores. There was a smudge of earth on her cheek. She heard his footstep on the brick path and looked up. The silence between them was very long. She was not the woman he had last seen in London. He could not have said precisely what had changed, and that difficulty was itself disquieting, because the change was not external, or not only external. It was something in the quality of her stillness. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they have given considerable thought to and arrived at a conclusion about. She stood, removed her gloves, and said, "Your Grace. You might have sent word." "I did not think it necessary," he said. "This is my home." "Yes," she said. "It is also mine." He had no answer for that. The first week of his return was conducted in the elaborate and exhausting language of polite distance. Eleanor was unfailingly correct. She ordered his rooms prepared and his preferred food served and his horse given proper exercise. She sat at dinner opposite him and spoke about estate matters with the precision of a steward, the East Wing repairs, the tenant renegotiations, the repair account now nearly spent but wisely. She believed, with a summary available if he wished to review it. She passed him salt and asked whether the wine suited and retired at a reasonable hour. She did not ask him why he had come. She did not reproach him for his year and more of absence. She did not make him feel, in any direct or dramatic fashion, that he had failed her. She simply showed him, every single day, what she had built in the place he had abandoned. And that was more devastating than any accusation. He reviewed the accounts on the third day, alone in the study, and sat with them for 2 hours. She had not merely maintained the estate. She had restructured it. The figures were clear and rational and annotated in her precise handwriting, with a brief explanatory note beside every significant decision. He recognized in those notes the kind of thinking that his London business associates were paid considerable sums to produce and rarely managed half so clearly. He asked, at dinner that evening, "Who taught you to read a set of agricultural accounts?" She looked up from her soup. "I taught myself," she said. "Your library contains several useful volumes on estate management." The key was in the steward's chest. "That library has been locked since my father's time." "Yes," she said. "I noticed." Something in his chest moved in a way he found extremely inconvenient. The first real rupture came on the 6th day, and it came not from Eleanor but from a man named Lord Farwell, who owned the neighboring estate to the east. Lord Farwell appeared unannounced, a habit, Eleanor noted privately, common to men who assumed the world would always arrange itself to their arrival, and informed the Duke over brandy in the drawing-room that he had been in negotiations with Mr. Petherwick regarding a possible boundary adjustment and that he was delighted to have the Duke home at last to finalize matters. Eleanor, who happened to be crossing the hall when this conversation drifted through the open door, stopped. She knew the boundary adjustment Lord Farwell was describing. She had reviewed the proposal in the correspondence archive 6 months ago and had written to Mr. Petherwick to express her concerns, namely, that the proposed adjustment would remove the eastern pasture from Ashvale land. The same pasture on which 3 tenant families relied for shared grazing rights, and that its loss would effectively make their farms unviable. Mr. Petherwick, apparently, had not passed her letter to the Duke. She entered the drawing-room. Lord Farwell looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had not expected to see a woman in a room where he was discussing something important. The Duke looked at her with something else, a sharp, watchful attention, as if he were rapidly recalibrating. "I believe," Eleanor said, with a pleasantness that had excellent manners on the outside and iron underneath, "that there may be some information missing from this discussion." "Your Grace." She sat down. And she laid out the case against the boundary adjustment with a clarity and a command of detail that reduced Lord Farwell's confident smile to something considerably more uncertain by the end of the first 5 minutes. She spoke of the tenant families by name. She cited the grazing rights from the estate charter, which she had found in the library. She explained, precisely and without drama, what the loss of that pasture would mean for 3 families who had farmed the Ashvale land for generations. When she had finished, Lord Farwell cleared his throat and said that perhaps further review was warranted. The Duke said, "I believe that concludes our discussion, Farwell. My wife will see you out." When Lord Farwell had gone, the Duke stood by the fireplace for a long moment with his hands behind his back. "You wrote to Petherwick," he said. "In April," she said. He did not reply. Another long silence. "Thank you," the Duke said. It came out somewhat roughly, as if the words had been kept somewhere unfamiliar and were not entirely accustomed to being used. Eleanor nodded once and left the room. The schoolroom children became, without either of them quite meaning it to happen, the first ground on which the Duke and Eleanor found themselves genuinely occupying the same space. He had been at Ashvale Hall 3 weeks when he passed the open door of the morning room on a Thursday and heard his wife's voice saying, with quiet patience, that there was no shame in reading a letter 3 times if you needed to read it 3 times, and that understanding carefully was always worth more than understanding quickly. He stopped in the doorway and watched her lean over a small boy's slate and trace the shape of a letter with her finger. And the boy looked up at her with the particular expression of a child who has decided to trust someone. The Duke went away and thought about that for a long time. That evening, unusually, he came to find her in the small parlor where she habitually spent her evenings, reading, writing letters, or reviewing the weekly household accounts. He poured himself a glass of wine without asking and sat down in the chair opposite hers, which she noted was a different quality of presence than his usual careful maintenance of distance. "You don't have to justify the schoolroom to me," he said. It wasn't quite an apology. But it was something. "I wasn't planning to," she said, without looking up from her book. He was quiet for a moment. "My mother organized something similar," he said finally. "When I was a boy. A reading room in the village. My father closed it when she died. He said it was an indulgence." Eleanor looked up then. His face, in the firelight, was not guarded in the way it usually was. The careful, constructed expression had slipped slightly, the way faces do in the evening when a person has been performing all day and is simply tired. "How old were you?" she asked. 8, he said. She considered this. Then she said, "The rector's wife helps now, on Thursdays. And Mrs. Drury has become indispensable, though she would not thank me for saying so." Something in his expression moved toward warmth, not quite there, but moving. "I can see that," he said. "She held out for 2 months," Eleanor said. "She is very stubborn." "So I understand," the Duke said. And the smallest possible suggestion of humor moved through his face, just barely, like light through heavy curtain. It was not much. But it was the first unrehearsed thing that had passed between them. She did not forget it. Over the following days she began to understand what lay beneath the Duke's careful construction. It came to her not in a dramatic confession but in accumulated small evidence, the way he avoided the East Wing even after it was opened. Because his father had died in the room at the end of the corridor and no one had ever suggested he might need to grieve that properly. The way he spoke of London as a duty rather than a pleasure, a sentence he was serving, not a life he was choosing. The way he had ridden out twice now to inspect the tenant farms and had come back both times quieter than he left. His face carrying something that looked very much like the belated recognition of a man who has begun to understand the extent of what he failed to attend to. He was not, she was slowly and reluctantly discovering, the hollow man she had first supposed. He was a man who had been taught, very effectively and very early, that feeling things was a form of weakness. And who had accordingly built a life of such complete and armored function that he had arrived at his 30s with a title, a fortune, and nothing else that was genuinely his. She did not tell him this. She was not in the business of explaining people to themselves. But she stopped avoiding his company quite so deliberately. The storm came in January, as the worst storms generally do, without adequate warning and with total commitment. It began as a heavy snowfall on the afternoon of the 13th and became, by midnight, a thing of considerable violence. The wind came off the moors and threw itself against the north face of the hall with the focused intention of something personal. And by morning 2 of the older stable outbuildings had partially collapsed and the approach lane was impassable under 3 feet of snow. Eleanor was awake before dawn because old Thomas had come to her door at 4 in the morning with the news that one of the tenant farm families, the Marshes, Caleb and his daughter and her 4 children, had sent a boy through the snow to say that the roof of their farmhouse had come in and they were in the barn with the animals and could not stay there. Through another night in such cold. The Duke found Eleanor in the entrance hall at 4:30 in the morning, dressed for heavy weather, pulling on her boots. "Where are you going?" he said. "The Marsh Farm," she said. "Their roof has come down. The lane is buried," he said. "Thomas knows the field path," she said. "It's longer but passable." He looked at her for a moment, the steady, irresistible practicality of her, the complete absence of drama, and then he said, "I'm coming with you," and went to get his coat. The journey to the Marsh Farm took an hour and a half and was, without question, the most physically demanding thing the Duke of Ashvale had done in a decade. The snow was deep and the wind was merciless and the field path was identifiable only to Thomas, who led them by lantern light with the calm certainty of a man who had navigated these fields in every variety of weather for 30 years. They brought the entire Marsh family back to the hall, the grandfather, the daughter, her husband who had come back from the far field, and all 4 children. The youngest of whom Eleanor carried on her back through the last quarter-mile of snow while the child slept against her shoulder in the inexhaustible way of very young children. In the kitchen of Ashvale Hall, at 6 in the morning, with the fire built high and the family warming themselves and Mrs. Beale producing an enormous and apparently effortless quantity of hot food. The Duke sat at the kitchen table, an extraordinary departure from his usual spatial arrangements, and drank tea from a plain kitchen cup and watched his wife move through the room. She knew where everything was. She moved with the ease of someone who belonged to a space completely. Mrs. Drury deferred to her without performance. Old Thomas reported to her naturally. The children reached for her without asking permission. She looked up and found him watching her and held his gaze for a long moment. Then she came and sat across from him at the table and wrapped both hands around her own cup. "You should have told me," he said quietly. "Told you what?" "Any of it," he said. "All of it. The farms. The children. The roof. The accounts. You should have written to me." "I did write to you," she said. "In the beginning. Twice." He was very still. "I did not receive those letters." She looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "I suspected as much, eventually. Mr. Petherwick, they would later discover, had made certain decisions of his own about what information the Duke required and what could be handled quietly without troubling his grace. And those decisions had served Mr. Petherwick's professional convenience admirably and his employer's not at all. The solicitor's quiet management of the boundary negotiation and the intercepted letters came to light over the following days. And the Duke dismissed him by the end of the week with a comprehensive and earned displeasure. But in that moment, in the warm kitchen at 6 in the morning with snow still pressing against the windows and the Marsh family's youngest child asleep on the bench beside the fire, what the Duke felt was something that had no professional or legal dimension at all. He had given this woman a ruin and an absence and a set of instructions delivered by proxy. And she had turned it into a home, not his home, not the cold and shuttered house of his childhood, but an actual home, where people were fed and children were taught and roofs were mended and farms were saved and no one who worked within its walls was less than fully seen. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She looked at him. "I owe you a debt I do not know how to pay," he said. "You owe me honesty," she said simply. "That will be sufficient to begin." February came in quieter than January, the way February sometimes does when it has borrowed all of January's fury and has nothing left to spend. The Duke did not go back to London. He stayed, which itself was a kind of decision. He rode out to the tenant farms. He sat in on the schoolroom on a Thursday, very quietly, in the back of the room, and listened to Eleanor teach a boy of 10 to write a sentence about the thing he loved most, and the boy wrote, after considerable deliberation, that he loved his dog and also bread, and Eleanor read this back to him with perfect seriousness and told him that both were excellent choices. The Duke had to look away, out the window, for a moment. He began to work alongside her rather than in parallel to her. They reviewed the accounts together. He brought in an architect to properly assess the East Wing and sat through that meeting at the same table with her and deferred to her practical knowledge of the building's current state, which was considerably more detailed than his own. He stopped pretending that she was managing things on his behalf. She was managing things. Full stop. But there was still something between them that had not yet resolved, a distance that was not hostility and not quite trust. A careful space that both of them maintained with the precision of people who had learned, in very different ways, the cost of leaving themselves unguarded. It was the rector who precipitated the final reckoning, unintentionally. He came to dinner on a Tuesday in late February, a kind and thoughtful man named Mr. Alderton, and over the meal he mentioned to the Duke that the parish had been planning a small celebration for the spring, nothing elaborate, he said, just a gathering on the hall grounds. A tradition from 20 years ago that the late Duchess had always hosted. He mentioned it as a courtesy, uncertain whether such a thing was still welcome. The Duke said, carefully, I believe that would be a matter for the Duchess. Mr. Alderton looked at Eleanor with warmth. Indeed, he said. She has been the reason this parish has had anything to celebrate for rather a long time now, if you will permit me to say so, Your Grace. Later that evening, after the rector had gone, the Duke came to the small parlor and stood in the doorway in a way he had not done since the very first night of their marriage, at a threshold, uncertain. May I come in, he said. Eleanor looked up from her letters. You have never asked before. I am asking now, he said. She set down her pen. He came in and sat in the chair opposite hers and was quiet for a moment in which the fire said everything neither of them was quite managing to say. I have been thinking about what I did, he said. Or rather what I failed to do. And I find I cannot dress it in better language than this. I gave you a neglected estate and an empty title and my complete indifference. And I told myself it was an arrangement and therefore no one was obligated to feel anything about it. He paused. I was a coward. Not the kind that runs from danger. The other kind. The kind that refuses to be present. Eleanor was very still. I had reasons, he said. My own history. My father's house. Certain things I decided, without ever quite deciding them consciously, that I would never again allow close enough to harm me. He looked at the fire. But the result was the same, regardless of the reason. You deserved better. The silence stretched. I know what I did here, he said. I know what it cost you. And I know what you built. And I know, he stopped. Then, quietly, I know that I do not deserve it. Any of it. This house. This woman. These people who look at you as though you gave them back something they had lost. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. His face was completely open in a way she had never seen it, the careful construction entirely gone, and underneath it a man who was genuinely, uncomplicatedly afraid. She said, I did not build this for you. I know, he said. I built it because it needed building, she said. Because the people here needed someone to be present. Because the house was worth saving and no one else was going to save it. I know that too, he said. But, she said, and something in her voice shifted very slightly, I think you might be worth saving as well. If you are willing to do the work of it. He looked at her. I am not a forgiving woman by nature, she said carefully. I am a practical one. And practically speaking, you are here. And you have stayed. And you have begun to act like a man who understands that a home requires actual presence to be a home. She paused. That is not nothing. Eleanor, he said. Tell me what you need. She considered that for a moment with her usual seriousness. Then she said, I need you to stay. Not out of obligation. Because you choose to be here. I choose to be here, he said, without hesitation. I chose it when I watched you carry a child through the snow at 5 a.m. and I understood, with complete clarity, that I had spent a year in London telling myself I had done my duty while the only person in my life who was actually doing anything real was a woman I had handed a set of broken keys and walked away from. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the first faint suggestion of evening birdsong, the very earliest harbinger of the coming spring, moved through the quiet. Eleanor looked at her husband for a long time. Then she said, then stay for dinner tomorrow. And the day after that. And we will see. He nodded. Then, carefully, he reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, not dramatically, not with grand sentiment, but with the deliberate and attentive care of a man who understands that the thing in his hand is something fragile and something real and something he has no intention of ever handling carelessly. Again. She did not pull away. The spring celebration, held on the grounds of Ashvale Hall in the first warm days of April, was the largest the parish had seen in a generation. The walled garden was open, and the kitchen had been working for 3 days. 11 children ran through the grounds with a freedom that made the old stone walls ring. Caleb Marsh was there with his family, and Mrs. Beale presided over the food with the ferocity of a general, and Mrs. Drury, who had, over the course of the winter, completed her complicated journey from uncertain welcome to absolute dedication, stood near the door of the hall and watched the grounds fill with people and wore an expression of satisfaction she was not bothering to conceal from anyone. The Duke stood beside Eleanor near the garden gate and watched it all, and he thought about a locked library and a set of neglected accounts and a letter that had never arrived. And he thought about a woman kneeling in winter earth examining a dormant rose, and he thought about the first night of their marriage, when he had stood at a doorway and said, "I am not a bad man," as though saying it might make it true. He turned to her. She was watching the children with a quiet, full expression that he had come to understand was what happiness looked like on a face that had been trained to need very little. "You stole something from me," he said, and his voice carried the private kind of warmth that had no interest in being overheard. She turned to look at him. "On the first night," he said, "you said something. I have thought about it a great deal since." He paused. "I have not yet decided what you are." "That is what you said." "I remember," she said. "I believe," he said, "that I have now decided." She waited. "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever failed to deserve," he said. "And if you will allow me to spend the remainder of my life attempting to deserve you, I will consider that the most important work I have ever undertaken." Eleanor looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then she said, "That is a very long sentence for someone who once delivered an entire set of marital instructions in a paragraph." "I have been improving," he said. "Yes," she said, and the word held everything she had learned about him since December: the morning room doorway, the kitchen table, the snow-covered field path, the fire and the open face and the careful hand. "You have." She turned back to watch the grounds. He stood beside her. Not an inch away. Not a careful arm's length. Beside her, in the way that means belonging. The afternoon light moved across the walled garden, warm and unhurried, the color of something beginning rather than something ending. And in the hall behind them, in the library whose key no longer needed to be searched for, on the shelf between the estate management volumes and the old correspondence archive, someone, Eleanor herself, one quiet October evening, had placed a small book of poems beside a dried sprig of rosemary, and the inscription inside the front cover, written in handwriting that was precise and steady and quietly undefeatable, read, "This house is not a monument. It is a life. Tended accordingly." And the house, which had been cold for a long time, was warm. And that, dear listener, is how a forgotten bride with muddy gloves and iron resolve became the heart of a house, a village, and a duke who had nearly allowed duty to extinguish every living thing in him. Eleanor did not wait to be saved. She saved the estate, the tenants, the children, the morning room, and eventually the man himself, one deliberate and dignified choice at a time. If this story moved you, we would love for you to let us know in the comments below. Tell us which moment stayed with you longest. Share this audiobook with a friend who loves historical romance, and if you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, this is the very best moment to do it. There are many more stories waiting, of women who refused to be erased, and the men who finally, gratefully, understood why. We will see you in the next chapter.